let's come back. One of the pillars beginning to sense that there is a goal, like goalposts. There's two pillars, like the two pillars of the Kabbalah, which is a medieval make-up, mock-up, that doesn't really get to it, etc., etc. The other that we're pairing like a tuning fork, because there's always a symmetrical pairedness to a set that can become a harmonic. It's what makes the universe a universe, and to be able to hear and then compose in the harmonic, making music, is what the cosmos is all about. As Pythagoras beautifully stated, said, wrote in Greek, the epithet is ipsa dixit, he said, Pythagoras, music of the spheres. There is such a thing as taking a string and putting your finger in the middle, and you get two out of one. And you put two fingers on that string. As long as the string is limited, you can do this. Then you get three. You can put three, and then you get four. So that in music, you can have a note, you can have a half note. You can have thirds, you can have fourths, you can have fifths, which is a very powerful composition. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony in D major is very powerful. Da, 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 da. You can have sixths, sevenths, all the way up to tenths. And classical, Pythagorean, harmonic music. And you can do an analytic on its basis. Holds up. As Frank Lloyd Wright observed wisely, architecture is like frozen music. But you can build architecture dynamically so that when you walk in it, when you walk through it, it turns into music. If you go to his Marin County Civic Center, built after the maestro died at 92, approaching 93, the building looks kind of like old science fiction, 50s science fiction, until you walk through it. And the pace of walking, about 2 miles an hour, that building stretches its angelic wings dynamically, and the whole composition soars into play. In the tough, huge metropolis of Dallas, Texas, Big D, the Dallas Theater Center looks very peculiar from the outside, from photos of it, and when you stand in it, it's just very peculiar. Until you get the musical key, is that the angle of vision that is dynamic is 30 degrees. And as soon as you get 30 degrees and double it to 60 and triple it to 90, can you get the hermetic drift? The Dallas Theater Center, no longer the Kalita Theater Center, no longer the Dallas Theater Center, it's the Frank Lloyd Wright Theater Center that comes into play. And there you are. At the Gamble House in Pasadena, built for the Gambles of Procter & Gamble in 1902. Green and Green, the architects, sent the Gamble scions to Europe for a year or two so that they would not be interfered with, and then built the house. And the harmonic index is a visual cloud motif. It's a horizon that has a flattened bubble in the center, so that you have this cloud symbol from Japan that also is like a American invention of the cedar shake house, craft house, only on a very large scale. And you see that cloud motif everywhere. It's on the back of the dining chairs. It's on the tiles, handmade, of the fireplace. And when you go to the third story of what would be this enormous open boat-like attic, the center beam holding the entire house together is one massive cloud symbol. There's not a nail in the green and green Gamble house. It's all dovetailed, wedged, doweled, and it holds. And still, through all the earthquakes, it's in very, very good shape. You have to understand that what is being offered here doesn't need nails. We don't need to tack down arguments or make ideological soirees hoping that they're convincing. When I started out in electrical engineering at the University of Wisconsin, the very first thing that we were told, incoming freshmen by Dean Shields, most of us were male, so he addressed us as, boys, in science you can work with theory, but in engineering you have to work with practice. You have to be able to build so it works, so it stands. And for this, the first purchase you're going to make is to go down to the engineering school bookstore, which is separate from the university bookstore. And you're going to buy a slide rule and a leather holster to put it in. And you're going to strap that on to your belt as if you were gunfighters, because you're going to learn the practice of building for real. And that's how I began at 17. The answer to Job is tunable and parable in the work being presented even now, some almost 60 years later. The book of Job is a Greek tragedy. Now, the author, Horace M. Callan, was a character. He lived to be 92. He just died in 1974. He was born in 1882 in a part of Eastern Europe that was then called Silesia. And his father, Jacob David Callan, was the Orthodox rabbi, very famous in Silesia, and his wife, Rebecca. And they were extremely learned and capable. And they decided that in 1887 they were going to move. They were doing very well, but they wanted to come to America. So they came, and young Horace, 5 years old, being given a learning home environment, Orthodox rabbi and his Rebecca wife, seeing to the fact that their firstborn son getting the best education you can get, and he eventually went to Harvard. And his introduction to Harvard in philosophy, that's what he wanted to be in. Yeah, I'd like to study philosophy, was George Santayana. And Santayana, of Spanish and English descent, was one of the most beautifully erudite philosophers of all time. His writing, his classic book is called The Sense of Beauty, still in print to all this time. Callan learned to be elegant and to understand that a elegant structure that doesn't just stand there like an ideological construct of whatever ilk or sort has to be load-bearing in that, like a bridge, it will take the load. It will work. And he understood that of all the forms philosophically of literature, that is the most dynamic is a poetic put into a dialogue, which is then a drama. And it is the dramatic play of the poetic in character that makes the play, and when it's done right, is magical. The grand night for singing. I feel like falling in love. That quality reached an apex in antiquity with Greek tragedy, which was a high poetic based upon a dance form of the Greek mysteries. In Greek, it's called chorea. In a chorea, one moves around this way and then pivots and then moves back around the other way. It's a double chiral with a pause in between, and then coming back, one has a stand. One has the presentation that you have done both sweeps together in a symmetry with the breath in between. Just like the word for Jesus in the Zohar is 4 Hebrew letters with an aspirant pause in between those two pairs. And that's how it's pronounced esoterically in the Zohar, the Book of Splendor. Because someone knew this wasn't just a name. It is important to see that Greek tragedy was never a genre in Hebrew. Never. Never used. The only time that one has a dialogue in the Old Testament, other than the book of Job, is in the Song of Solomon. And it's not by Solomon. Proverbs is by Solomon. And you have Solomon's own writing style. You can read it. It's beautiful. It's fine. He says, when I was young, I was fortunate. I took wisdom as my feminine instructor, guide. The wisdom of Solomon is female. The author of the Song of Songs is female. She's an African female. Her name was Makeda. Makeda. And Makeda was the Queen of Sheba. And the Song of Songs has an antiphonal voicing where Solomon's words of wisdom are brought by the feminine living wisdom, Makeda, the Queen of Sheba, into an interplay with hers. And so you have the Song of Songs. It's an exponential transform. The book of Job is a hermetic distillation of that transform. When he was born, about the 3rd generation of those translators that came to Alexandria from Israel, those 6 masters of Hebrew and at the same time every one of the 72 was a master of Greek. How does this happen? How does this happen in Israel? Because the development of Hebrew as a written language reaching a poetic has its original literature. Everyone still reads it in translation. It's called the Psalms of David. And the Psalms of David is the first time that Hebrew as a language begins to have a kind of a viability of a very, very high poetic. The written Hebrew that is there from Moses has its qualities, but its qualities are a linking forthrightness. This begets this, and this begat that, and so forth. And you get the linkage of how all of this comes together as like a grand epic, a historia of epic proportions. From Adam through the development of the patriarchs with Abraham as the pivot, through the descendants to Joseph in Egypt, who becomes the master of Egypt under only the Pharaoh, the second most powerful man in that part of the world at the time, whose wife, his wife was the daughter of the sister of the 12 brothers for whom the 12 tribes were portioned. Their sister was named Dinah. And Dinah, after she was saved from her rapes, and her rapists were killed by her brothers, they sent her to Egypt in a very covered, protective way. And there Dinah became the wife of the head priest of Heliopolis. And their daughter was Asenath, and she was the wife of Joseph of Egypt. And they had 2 sons. And those 2 sons took the place of the tribe that had originally been the tribe of Joseph. And one of the tribes had been excerpted as special, the tribe of Levi, so that the Josephites became a pair, and the Levites, the mysterious tribe that was then esoterically like a 13th tribe, and the sons of Joseph and Asenath became tribe-holding, land-holding, tradition-holding, patriarchal-holding members. If you don't know this, you can be as orthodox as you want and not know, and not be farther into, beyond the truth of knowing, into the high dharma beyond knowing, and that is of visioning, so that the light is dynamically perfect, pure. Then you can really see. You can see knowing for the good thing that it is, but you can see seeing as the excellent unlimitedness that it is real. You can move from complete, that is good, to perfection, that is real. That's what's going on, folks. The book of Job is a Greek tragedy, is the 3rd generation, the grandson generation of the translators that made the Greek Bible then in Greek is called the Septuagint. meaning the 70. Yeah, they truncated the 72 to 70. The Septuagint. It's still in print. A new translation into English has just been made. Oxford University Press. The old translation, which I've had a copy for at least half a century, is still good. It's fine. The new one is like refined. Of course they're expensive. So that the author of the book of Job inherited the Alexandrian Hellenistic Judaism cosmic scope and saw that one could reach back into the origins 1,000 years before David. What happened 1,000 years before David is the time of Abraham. Reaching all the way back to the time of Abraham, born about 2000 BC, had his vision at 75 of the Promised Land, and at 75 took his wife Sarai. She didn't become Sarah until she was pregnant and gave birth to Isaac. Then she became Sarah. And he took his cousin, and they took all of their flocks and all of their fellow Jews, and they went to the Promised Land. It wasn't a Promised Land that they conquered by sword. Abraham was very, very vision clear. He got permission to have his flocks, but the first place that he bought was a cave in the high city called Hebron. And that cave is named the Cave of Machpelah. And he said at the time to an assembled group of people, leaders, "Look, leadership," he said. "I'm an old man. I have a lot of experience. I can see seeing clearly. I want to pay for this cave." And so the Cave of Machpelah is the first time that the Promised Land became physical, geophysical. And that cave has an architectural structure that is still there almost 4,000 years later in Hebron. You can go there. The graves of Abraham and Sarah are there. The graves of Isaac and Rebekah are there. The wife of Jacob, Rachel, was not possible because of conditions to put her in the Cave of Machpelah, and so she was buried at the crossroads coming out of Jerusalem just before it went into Bethlehem, and that's where she was buried, Rebekah's well. And Jacob, likewise, could not be buried there. He's buried at the original spring in what traditionally was Samaria. And Jacob's well was the place that Abraham originally had the watering of his herds, and Isaac's watering of their herds, and so forth. And so Jacob was placed there, so that Jacob is under Mount Gerizim. So that when it came time for a very powerful, original prophet to be born and raised, that prophet's name was Samuel. And Samuel was born and raised on Mount Gerizim, on its slopes all the way down to Jacob's well. That's the well where Jesus, centuries and centuries later, while all the disciples were going to get food, he asked a woman coming to the well for water for a drink, that she was pulling up water from the well, and she gave to him. And that was the parable of the Good Samaritan, because he understood, because he could see beyond seeing itself, into visioning beyond history into the real. This is not a level. This is not an argument. It's not an idea. I'm an old, trained, ancient engineer. If it doesn't work, if it doesn't stand, the architecture I can vision is not going to be an art that will work. When I first began this in the early 1980s, I had no idea, which was great, but used the ancient architectural based on engineering. Frank Lloyd Wright was an architect who was an engineer at the University of Wisconsin, just like me. You take what you know works and you develop from that. And then you use that as an investigative survey, and you do your survey. As Wright said, if a building is built right, you can't imagine it anywhere but where it is. It grew out of the site. And the site is whatever it really is. It's important that Callan is the first to be able to understand, as the favored son of an Orthodox rabbi, recently become American. One of the teachers that was there at Harvard was a lifelong friend of Callan's. His name was Alain Locke, Alainlocke, whom was the first African-American Rhodes Scholar. This was back in the 19th century. The next time there was an African-American Rhodes Scholar was 1960. Are you hearing this? It is the Queen of Sheba. It is the African-American Rhodes Scholar, later on, that encouraged Callan to understand how can a scriptural Jewish Bible, Old Testament book be a Greek tragedy. There are no tragedies. Tragedy is a high Dharma form made by Aeschylus, because Aeschylus was very close friends. His lifelong buddy was Pindar. And Pindar is the great lyric poet of classical literature. Pindar is head, shoulders, wings, and winged ankles above everybody else. When somebody did a translation of Pindar back in the 1950s, great English Cambridge Don C.M. Bora wrote a review of it and said, "This will not do. Pindar is like an eagle. You don't leash an eagle and then take it for short little walks." Pindar, his Greek is all about athletes, but it's about the dynamic of athletes going beyond what is possible. No one can do that. This man did it. No one can come hobbling to the plate in a World Series baseball game cannot even stand still, like Kirk Gibson hitting that home run off Dennis Eckersley, who's a Hall of Fame relief pitcher. No one can do that. Gibson did it. Vin Scully, everyone can still hear it. The impossible has happened. It is not possible. It has never happened. It's never happened before or since. It can't happen. It happened. The book of Job is a Greek tragedy, was finally pieced together by Horace Kallen and published in 1918. It's the first edition. Just as World War I was ending, Horace Kallen brought his courage to be with those who had fallen in places like Flanders Fields or in the Battle of the Somme, where the long trench, like an open festering scar across Europe, took 1.5 million lives in a few months. All those young men on both sides of a great earthquake trench that showed that European history was not only fractured, it was like a San Andreas fault. It's going to be subject to earthquakes without end, more and more severe. You are going to have a nuclear war. Absolutely for sure. Bertrand Russell, who lived to be 97, said, "Man has never made a weapon that he hasn't used." One has to revision the world and revision mankind as a species. And the book of Job is the initial way in which that happens. The fragmented, dispersed book of Noah, there's a few fragments that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, one of the few Targums found complete in the Dead Sea Scrolls is the Targum of Job. What is a Targum? A Targum is a translating of the Hebrew of the writing, the scripture, into Aramaic. It's like a very heavily inflected dialect of Hebrew. A less deflected dialect current with Aramaic was Syriac. And Syriac was a dialect of Greek, which is related to Hebrew because they both became discursive languages at the same time. The beginnings of what turned out to be Greek was Linear A, which was contemporaneous with the way in which the North Semitic alphabet was first made in letters that became Hebrew, and first made in ways that Linear A, later on through Linear B, became recognizable as Greek, as classical Greek. So that Greek and Hebrew, by the time they get to Alexandria, on the level of Ptolemy II Philadelphus and his wife Arsinoe. There's a new biography of Arsinoe because it's for the first time that anybody is paying attention to them. Just published. And the same publisher, Oxford University Press, a biography of Berenice II. It is the first time ever that anyone has taken the engineering architectural care to understand that the women are not disposable. They're not dispensable. If you don't know about the Queen of Sheba, you can't possibly know about Solomon. And if you don't know that, you don't know that the Ark of Covenant was taken by the son of Solomon, who was at the same time the son of the Queen of Sheba. Makeda's son was named Menelik. And when he was 21, he went to see his father for the first time. And Solomon by that time had become sort of desolate. Too many women, too much money, too much triumph. One can get bloated and forget that wisdom is real in that person. And you don't keep with that person, then the interference waves come into play. And you become fractured, like a kind of Dutch ceramic that is built on fractures. Or you become piecemeal like the Byzantine mosaics. And pretty soon you try to do abstract art in mosaics, and you try to do it really fancy to keep them floating, and what you end up with is a blizzard of confusion. And you say, well, it must be beautiful. More next week.